It always starts with something small, something so ordinary that you never think twice about it. A faint sound in the dark, a flicker on a screen, a moment of silence that feels heavier than it should be. You tell yourself it's nothing, maybe a glitch or your imagination playing tricks on you. But deep down, something feels wrong. You can't explain it, but you know you're not alone. And that's when it begins, the moment you start to notice the static, the moment it starts to notice you. The first signal came like a whisper hidden in silence. It was a calm night where everything felt still and ordinary. The air was heavy and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Then out of nowhere the television came to life on its own. The sudden flash of light filled the dark room and the sound of faint static crept into the air. It was soft at first, almost harmless. A gentle hiss that blended with the quiet, but as the moments passed, that sound began to change. It started to pulse, like it had a rhythm, like it was breathing. The person watching felt something strange, a pull to look closer. The static was not random anymore. It swirled and shimmered in strange patterns, forming waves that almost looked alive. The glow from the screen painted the walls with cold light, and every flicker seemed to move in sync with something unseen. As they leaned in closer, the noise began to whisper. The sound was low, broken, like a voice trapped far away. It said nothing clear, yet it felt like words were trying to crawl through the static, trying to reach them. The air grew colder. With each second, every small sound in the house vanished. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. The static grew louder, and the shapes inside it began to shift, forming outlines. Almost like faces. The person tried to blink it away, but the image only grew sharper. It was as if the static knew it was being watched, and it wanted to be seen. Then the lights flickered once more. The static screamed and everything went dark. The television still glowed faintly, even though the power was off, and in that dim shimmer, something inside the screen seemed to move ever so slightly, something that looked back. The static began to change. It was no longer just random noise flickering across the screen. It moved with purpose, twisting and shifting, like it was trying to form something the person watching couldn't look away. The longer they stared, the more the patterns seemed to make sense. At first it was just streaks of light and darkness dancing together, but slowly shapes began to emerge. Faint outlines of faces appeared for just a second, then vanished. Eyes blinked open, then dissolved into nothing. The sound of the static deepened, growing rough and uneven, like breathing that didn't belong to the person in the room every night. The signal returned, stronger than before. Sometimes the screen would turn on, even when the power cord was unplugged. The room would fill with that strange electric hum, and the static would pulse like it had a heartbeat. The person started to notice things moving in the corner of their vision, reflections that didn't match their own. They tried to film it, but every recording came out corrupted, full of distorted images and whispers hidden deep within the audio. When they slowed the sound down, they could hear fragments of words, sentences spoken in a language that didn't seem human. The static was no longer trapped inside the screen. It began bleeding into reality. The glow from the television reached farther than it should, stretching across the walls and flickering like cold fire. It left marks, tiny black spots that burned into the paint. The person covered the screen with a blanket, but even then the static's faint light bled through the house, started to feel wrong. The air always buzzing, the shadows always trembling. The person could feel the signal pressing against their skin like invisible fingers tracing every heartbeat, as if something from inside the noise was trying to find its way out. The whispers inside the static began to take form, growing louder each night, until they no longer sounded like distant noise. They became voices overlapping, speaking over one another like 1,000 people, trapped between channels. Their words were broken, fragmented pieces of sentences that didn't make sense, yet carried a heavy meaning. The person could hear their own name being spoken, slowly drawn out, as if the thing inside the static was learning how to pronounce it. Each time they heard it, chills crawled down their spine, because the voice sounded almost human, almost familiar, but twisted, as if someone was imitating them from inside the screen. The nights grew longer, and the static became unbearable. It wasn't just sound anymore. It had a weight, a vibration that seeped through the walls and into the floor. The hum of electricity around the house began to sync with it, the lights flickering in rhythm like the entire place was breathing with the signal. Even when the TV was unplugged, the whispers continued echoing from other devices the radio would turn on by itself. Phones would vibrate without calls. Speakers would buzz faintly whenever the person walked by. It felt like the thing inside the static had learned to move beyond the screen. The voice started to follow them everywhere. Whenever they tried to sleep, it would call from the darkness, soft at first, then clearer, like someone standing right beside the bed, whispering through their ear. The person stopped sleeping, entirely terrified that the voice would grow stronger when their eyes closed. Sometimes they could hear the static coming from their own heartbeat. That faint hiss that never stopped. It was no longer a question of what was happening. The truth was far worse. The static was no longer reaching out to them. They were the one being pulled into it, bit by bit. Every sound, every signal, every whisper, trying to merge them into its world. The night the static finally took form was the moment everything changed. The air inside the room turned heavy, thick, like invisible hands were pressing down on every surface. The hum of electricity grew so loud, it felt like it was coming from inside their chest. The screen flickered once, twice, then exploded into a violent storm of noise. The static swirled faster than ever before stretching across the glass like it was being stirred by something underneath. The light flashed white and black again and again until the outlines began to shift. A figure slowly appeared inside the chaos, its body bending and twisting as if made from television distortion. The shape stepped closer, pressing itself against the glass. The surface rippled like water, bending with every motion. The figure had no face, only shadows where its eyes should have been. Its limbs shook like broken wires, sparking with faint blue light. Each breath it took came out as a long, static hiss echoing through the room. The person tried to move, but couldn't. Their body froze, their voice caught in their throat. They could only watch as the thing pushed its hand through the screen. The glass didn't shatter. It simply melted away, letting the creature step out into the room like it had always belonged there. The air went completely still. The temperature dropped so low that the person could see their breath in the pale glow. The thing stood tall, trembling slightly with every movement as though it was still learning how to exist outside the static. Its head tilted slowly as if observing everything, its attention finally locking onto the person watching. Its body crackled with faint distortion lines, parts of it flickering like a corrupted video. It began to move closer, one step at a time. Each step made the floor vibrate with a faint electrical hum. The smell of ozone filled the air, and every device in the room turned on by itself, playing nothing but white noise. The lights flickered and died, leaving only the screen's faint glow to light the room. The creature raised its hand and reached toward the person. Its fingers were long and uneven, bending in impossible angles when it touched their arm. The static sound burst through their head like a scream. It wasn't pain, it was something worse. A sharp electric burn that went straight into their thoughts. The room blurred. The walls twisted. The entire world seemed to glitch for a second, as if reality itself was breaking apart. The thing leaned close, its head twitching violently, and in that moment, the person could hear it whisper one word deep inside their mind, a word that didn't belong to any language. Yet they understood exactly what it meant. The next morning, the house was quiet. But it was not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was a silence that hummed beneath the skin. A silence that carried the faint buzz of something still alive. The television was dark, its screen cracked and burned around the edges, but the center still glowed faintly with a pulse like a dying heartbeat. The smell of burnt metal and ozone lingered in the air. The person thought it was overthought. The thing had gone back into whatever place it came from, but that belief lasted only until they heard it again, the faint hiss of static echoing from somewhere deeper in the house. They followed the sound into the hallway. Every device they owned had come to life on its own. The radio, the phone, the laptop, even the small digital clock beside the bed. All of them glowed with the same white noise, flickering shapes crawling beneath their surfaces. The whispers returned louder, now clearer. They carried fragments of laughter and cries, weaving together into something almost human. The person tried to unplug everything, but it didn't matter. Even without power, the static remained alive, pulsing like a heartbeat that refused to stop. It followed them from room to room, clinging to the air like smoke. Days passed, but sleep never came. Every shadow in the house began to move differently, not quite matching the light around them. Reflections turned into traps each time the person looked into a mirror or the black surface of a screen. There was a delay, a slight hesitation before the reflection copied the movement. Sometimes the reflection smiled when they didn't. Sometimes it leaned closer when they stepped back. It became clear that the static had not been destroyed. It had spread. It was in the air, the walls, the light. The sound it had taken root inside the house. And every whisper through every device was a reminder that it was not finished. The person began to see it, even without the screens. Late at night, the corners of the room would ripple as though the air itself was made of pixels bending and twisting with invisible pressure. The faint outline of the creature flickered for only seconds. But those seconds felt endless. Its presence carried a strange calmness mixed with unbearable fear, like the quiet before a storm that never ends. They could feel it watching. From every reflective surface, from every hum of electricity in the walls, its voice no longer needed the static to speak. It now lived inside the silence, inside the gaps between each breath, reminding them that once something comes through the static, it never truly leaves. The warning came not through words, but through the air itself, a heavy pressure that seemed to whisper inside the bones. The nights had turned endless, each one darker and quieter than the last. The static was no longer confined to screens. It lived in the silence between heartbeats. The person could feel it breathing in rhythm with them, invisible but close. Their home no longer felt like a place. It felt like a signal, a transmitter for something beyond the world they knew. Every time the lights flickered, they could see faint shadows bending in the corners, shapes that vanished. When looked at directly, the whispers changed tone. They no longer called their name. They spoke to them. They said things that no human could understand, layers of voices overlapping like a chorus of echoes from a place without air each. Time the person tried to block it out. The sound found a new way to reach them through phone calls that contained nothing but faint breathing, through the gentle hum of power lines outside. Even through their own thoughts, the static had learned their mind. It no longer needed sound or signal. It only needed connection. Days blurred together, and the world outside began to change. As well, streetlights flickered in patterns that matched the pulse of the static. Radios in passing cars would buzz when they walked by. Strangers on the street would turn their heads as if they heard the same distant voice. The person realized the static wasn't hunting just them anymore. It was spreading, feeding on every signal, every network, every spark of electricity, like a disease made of sound and light. The fear became something deeper than terror. It became awareness, a knowing that the static was alive, and that it had found a way to exist in everything. The screens no longer needed to glow for it to be seen. The air itself shimmered faintly at night, as though thin threads of static floated through. The darkness, sometimes when they spoke, their voice would distort, breaking into the same digital crackle that once came from the television. They could feel the thing's presence inside every wire, every device, every reflection. It had become part of the world, and the world had accepted it. Now there was no escaping the sound. The static followed wherever they went, echoing faintly in their ears, even when there was no power, no signal, nothing left to transmit. It was a hum that lived beneath everything, a faint reminder that something had crossed over and refused to go back. The person understood now that it never needed to enter their home. It had always been here, waiting inside the silence of every machine, inside the noise that fills the spaces between thoughts, watching, learning, whispering through the static that binds everything together. The sound never really stopped. It only grew quieter, softer, like it was hiding, waiting for the right moment to return. Sometimes in the middle of the night, when everything is still, the faint hum creeps back through the walls, a whisper buried beneath the silence. They say it's just interference, just background noise. But if you listen closely, you can hear it breathing. You can hear it remembering your name.